periodismo y sobre todo en las redacciones y los medios de comunicación. Gracias, Carlos, por esa magistral intervención, por estos datos, este contexto, estas cifras reales sobre este continente que, como bien has dicho, se mueve, avanza y lejos de estar detenido. Y además avanza de forma muy rápida, ¿no? Nunca escuchamos referencias a Asia o a Europa como si fuera un país. Sin embargo, eso ocurre mucho con el continente africano y eso ha sido un elemento que hemos debatido mucho en estos encuentros de periodistas aquí impulsados por CASA África. Se representa como ese territorio homogéneo cuando estamos hablando de la realidad de 54 países, de 1.300 millones de personas y de una diversidad tremenda, ¿no? Estas más de 2.000 lenguas representan un tercio de todos los idiomas del mundo. Así que vamos a intentar abrir esta ventana que nos invitaba a hacer Carlos López y vamos a presentar al siguiente invitado, Víctor Mark-Onyegbu. Él es responsable de subvenciones y desarrollo comunitario de África No Filter. Es un estratega panafricano con más de 18 años de experiencia en el sector público, filantropía, desarrollo comunitario y comunicación. Ha liderado iniciativas que integran creatividad, innovación y narrativas transformadoras que además han tenido un impacto y una influencia en políticas nacionales y estrategias de donantes tanto en África como en el Reino Unido y en la diáspora. Ha gestionado fondos millonarios, ha fomentado alianzas globales y ha diseñado intervenciones narrativas que amplifican las voces africanas. Ha participado en 2024 en el programa Follow Bellagio, posee una formación ejecutiva en Oxford, Cambridge y Harvard y ha recibido múltiples reconocimientos, incluyendo un doctorado honorario. Y hoy nos va a hablar de este coste del estereotipo y cómo combatirlo desde África. Y esta es la misión de África No Filter. Para quienes no lo conocen, que lo dudo, yo creo que todos los que estamos aquí conocemos a esta organización que tiene una relevancia enorme en el panorama mediático africano y es fundamental para CASA África contar con su participación en ese encuentro de periodistas, porque nos vamos a preguntar hoy aquí ¿qué precio paga el continente africano por el estereotipo narrativo? Algo que ellos llevan muchísimos años investigando, analizando y además lo hacen desde múltiples puntos de vista. Hace poco, como ya adelantó Carlos, pudimos conocer esa innovadora campaña que ha tenido un impacto global tremendo sobre el tamaño real del mapa del mundo y cómo este empequeñece la dimensión real del continente africano. Así que muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos. Víctor Mark-Onyegbu, adelante, recibámoslo con un fuerte aplauso.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was quite an elaborate introduction. Thank you so much. And a very incredible opportunity to be speaking right after one of our legends and our icons in Africa, Professor Carlos Lopez. I think he deserves another round of applause. Thank you. My name is Victor Mark-Onyegbu, and as introduced, I am the head of grants and community building at Africa No Filter. Thank you so much to CASA Africa for all you do for the continent. Thanks to the team, the logistics, Joe and Tossel. Thank you so much to every one of you for also participating at this event. I've got just 20 minutes, so I'll try my best to run through some slides, especially the ones that I also talked about yesterday. Some of you were here yesterday, so you would be familiar with some of the things I'm going to say in my opener. I work for Africa No Filter. Africa No Filter is an advocacy organization that works with storytellers. We equip storytellers, we support storytellers, we invest in media platforms across Africa and diaspora. And we do this to empower them to be able to shift narratives about Africa, from narratives that are based on poverty, corruption, poor leadership, diseases, conflicts, to narratives that are built around a dynamic continent that showcases our opportunity, progress, and innovation in Africa. We did a research recently. I talked about this yesterday as well. Recently, we did a research that showed that 70% of the content that comes out of Africa or that represents Africa falls into 5 major frames. The stories that we read, the content we see on media, falls into these 5 frames, perhaps 6. The first one is that Africa is a country. We see this all the time. We talk about this all the time. I gave the example of the taxi driver that picked me up from the airport when I arrived Madrid some days ago. And I asked him he asked me what country I was arriving from, and I told him Nigeria. And he said he's never heard about Nigeria. Nigeria, by the way, is a country of over 220 million human beings. And he's never heard about Nigeria. And so I told him, what have you heard about? Or where do you think I'm from? He said he knows I'm from Africa. And I said, yeah, I'm from Africa, but I'm from Nigeria in Africa. And Nigeria is a country like Spain, like Italy, like France, like Netherlands. And he was just looking at me, right? And so we have a lot of uninformed people who continue to push out these unified identity, which to a very large extent is false, right? A South African is different to a Nigerian, as a Nigerian is different to a Ghanaian, just as you have the Italians and the French and so on, right? We share a lot of commonalities and similarities, but we have our peculiar differences. And I think that needs to be understood. I spoke to a friend who walked into an Ivy League university. He went to the library to do some research, and he was researching about arts. And he saw Spanish arts, he saw Danish art, he saw Italian art. And when he went to the section where he was meant to see arts from African countries, he saw African art. And he was like, this is a country of 1.4 billion people heading to 2.5 billion people by 2050, with so much rich and diverse culture, very dynamic continent, and you group all the artistic expressions of these 20% of the world into just one block called African art. And I think it's just so much injustice to the peculiarities that we have in Africa, right? And then the frames that depict the stories that we see in Africa falls into conflicts, poverty, corruption, poor leadership, and diseases. 70% of all that we consume about Africa falls into those frames, and it leads to 3 persistent stereotypes, or 3 persistent narratives, so to say. And those narratives are that the continent is broken, that Africa is a case that needs to be fixed, that Africa is dependent, and so we have to constantly outsource the solutions to the challenges on the continent. And the last and the most debilitating of all of them is that Africans lack agency. And I said yesterday, what this means is that we do not even understand our problems, let alone having the will and the capacity to fix those problems. And that is really, really damaging to Africans. Now, I picked a few examples of how we see stereotypes playing out on the continent and some of the consequences. One of them is in aid and donor relationships. Sometimes aid within the African context is framed in ways that strips the communities of their decency, of their dignity, and most importantly, of their agency. It undermines the experiences and it tips the balance of power. It reinforces the current power structures that is extremely disadvantageous to the continent of Africa. We also see in business and investments Internationally, coverage about business in Africa is dominated by references to foreign powers. I talked about this yesterday. Africa has been reduced to a piece of cake that is shared between Russia, China, the West, the United States, and you see that 70% of conversations about business in Africa is done with reference to the interest of these powers, as opposed to the peculiarities and the needs and the challenges and the opportunities that exist within the business sector, opportunities that, if well conversed about, can open doors to investments, opportunities that are crying for attention, challenges that need to be addressed. But the conversations are purely about the interest of the superpowers. We saw that recently. For the very first time, the G20 held in South Africa on African soil, and the conversations were completely dominated by the friction between South Africa and the United States, right? And there was hardly so much focus on the real issues that we should see coming out of the continent, especially being the very first time that the G20 was holding on African soil. And I think that was a very big missed opportunity for the continent and focus on the issues that should matter to us as a people. African countries are unjustifiably perceived as higher risk by international investors and multilaterals, and are therefore paying significantly more for credit when compared with other non-African countries with similar political and socio-economic conditions. I will unpack this a little bit in a few minutes. International media are more likely to negatively frame issues that impact on businesses in Africa, but when we talk about how Africans see themselves, how we see ourselves, hear this. African media are twice as likely to reference corruption in their coverage of business in Africa. So there's a great deal of work that we need to do, we as Africans, right? So we're not just pointing fingers, we're also telling ourselves we've got to do better as a continent. Now, we did a research recently, and thanks to Professor Carlos Lopez and some other partners who worked with us, we worked with Africa Practice to do a research on the cost of media stereotypes to Africa. We talk about stereotypical consequences on the continent, but very little effort has gone into putting a price tag, putting numbers to the problem. And when you put numbers to a problem, it makes it more understandable. You begin to appreciate the magnitude of that challenge. And that's what we try to do with this research. And what we found in this research is what I said earlier, that African countries are unjustifiably perceived as higher risk by international investors and multilaterals, and are therefore paying significantly more for credit when compared with other countries in other geographical areas with similar socioeconomic conditions as these African countries. Now, this video is going to explain all that I've been trying to say, and right after the video, we will continue the presentation.
Africa loses up to $4.2 billion in inflated interest payments, not because of bad governance but because of bad press. To quantify the cost of global media bias, Africa No Filter and Africa Practice analyze 7 countries: Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, and 3 non-African, Malaysia, Thailand, Denmark's election cycle spanning 2 years, 1 year before and after elections. The report collected thousands of news articles from major outlets, BBC, CNN, Reuters, Financial Times. Using sentiment analysis, keyword frequency tracking, and correlation with financial data, sovereign bond yields, FDI, and stock indices. The findings: 88% of global media articles about Kenya during elections were negative. Compare that to Malaysia, 48% same political risk rating. Violence appeared in 5.8% of headlines about Kenya. In Thailand, 0% despite similar unrest. The term rigging appeared in 16% of Kenyan election articles. In Malaysia, just 2%. Egypt and Thailand had the same political risk rating, but Egypt pays 6 times more in bond yields. Overall, African countries got more media attention, but more negative sentiment. And the consequence? A higher cost of borrowing. Bond yields are directly linked to media sentiment. If African countries were covered with the same tone as similar nations, Egypt could save $495 million. Kenya can save up to $163 million. Nigeria can save up to $67 million. South Africa $104 million. When extrapolated, this translates to an estimated $4.2 billion yearly loss in inflated borrowing costs. This isn't just about bad PR. What if this bias flipped? If we told stories of resilience, innovation, and growth, we would lower perceived risk and lower borrowing costs. Let's tell better stories about Africa and tell Africa stories better. Download the report now.
Thank you very much. Hello? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now, what we have seen is just a fraction of the consequence of negative media coverage on Africa, just a fraction. We didn't even check the entire spectrum of economic consequences. We only looked at borrowing costs, inflated borrowing costs, as it relates to sovereign bonds, right? And we can see $4.2 billion loss yearly translates to, these are the opportunity costs. Clean drinking water for 2/3 of Nigeria's population. Nigeria is a population of over 220 million people, and a vast majority of that population could be taken care of with these funds. These funds could also immunize over 73 million children, which is more than the combined populations of Angola and Mozambique, right? This cost could also provide education for over 12 million children, which is the entire population of Tunisia. So you begin to understand the magnitude of the challenge that we are grappling with on the continent. Now, I talked about the impact being deeper than the numbers can show. And there are economic costs to the continent. We've just talked about a fraction of economic consequences, economic costs. There are also reputational costs, the brand values of African brands, the prejudices against businesses and innovation on the continent. There are political costs as well. There are costs that show up in foreign policy. There are costs that show up in other forms of global decision-making that regards Africa. There are media costs as well. Stories, and you will know better than me on this. Stories have to fit to certain stereotypes to get visibility. What people have been conditioned to expect about Africa. If those stories go against those stereotypes, then you're basically swimming against the tide. But those stories have to conform to terrorism, to lack, to despair, to migration, people wanting to leave the continent, lack of hope. Those are the kind of stories that global audiences have been conditioned to expect from the continent of Africa. But very importantly, there are also social costs. Racism, xenophobia, brain drain. These are costs that we sometimes cannot put a price tag on, but they probably have more significant consequences than what we have just seen in terms of the economic cost to the continent on sovereign bonds. Now, one of the social costs is the misconception that Africa is smaller than it actually is. You would see on this map that the true size of Africa is not what you have always been seeing on the maps. And we have been told a lie for 450 years. And we launched a program last year called the Correct the Map campaign to challenge this misrepresentation. For a very long time, the world navigators have used something called the Mercator projection. And the Mercator projection, you could argue technically it was more feasible to have the Mercator projection, of the globe for navigational purposes. And so when the world still had all the sailors moving from one part of the world to another, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the British, they used the Mercator projection, right? But that has gone beyond, the world has gone beyond that point. And we can now see that other map agencies and navigation agencies like Google, that produces the Google Maps that we use for the GPS, and even the military sector and all the other sectors that rely on navigation or rely on the maps, have continued to build all of their tools and facilities on this false impression of the true size of Africa. And we can see from this map that what we have been accustomed to seeing about the continent of Africa is very false. Africa is the second largest continent, and we are not just about this because of the size, but there are unconscious biases that are cultivated by false narratives, right? And so we are really about the false narratives that this misrepresentation of Africa breeds. We have our children going to school and learning about a continent, right, in a way that is false. And so decisions about Africa, whether in the development sector, in the economics, and the social space, are based on the false representation of Africa. And I just don't think this is good about Africa, as it would not be for any other part of the world. We are not asking for Africa's map to be changed or for the world map to be changed, and Africa should be presented in a certain way to the detriment of other parts of the world. We're only asking for the true representation of all parts of the world, and there's something that can make that possible called the equal Earth projection. And so we're having conversations with the Googles, the ISRI, the map agencies, and all the other organizations that deal with these types of instruments. We're having conversations with them, and it's been extremely positive. Now, let's talk about how we got here. How did we get here? Sometimes we need to step back and think. I did a little research from some of the tools from Africa No Filter, and I realized that, and this is why I keep talking about the power of the media, some of the events that we have celebrated globally, some of the blockbuster films, some of the wonderful literature that we continue to teach in schools, in our various schools, we teach our children about them. Some of the historical events that we applaud, right? Some of these things have led us to where we got to, and I'll tell you how. When you look at this, in 1878, there was a book written by Henry Morton Stanley, and it was called Through the Dark Continent. I don't know how many of you have encountered that book, but that book did tremendous damage to the image of Africa. Go down to another book written by Joseph Conrad, and I'm sure most of us have heard that name several times. The Heart of Darkness. It's always about a dark place, mysterious place, and that is the kind of narrative that has been thrown, globally about Africa. It's about a man on a divine mission to save native savages of Africa. Go down to sometime in 1952, when the struggle for the nationalistic struggle and struggle for independence took roots, especially in a place like Kenya, where you had the Mau Mau struggle. The uprising in Kenya started with the revolt against British colonialism, but what we saw was that it was projected, it was framed as terrorism, right? It wasn't framed as a nationalistic struggle by African states to gain independence from colonial powers, right? Let's go down to sometime in 1985. I'm sure we all remember the song, "We Are the World, We Are the Children," right? And it's a noble cause. Michael Jackson came together with other wonderful musicians of the time, Lionel Richie, Michael Jackson, Diana Ross. They all came together and they formed a band called USA for Africa. It features some of the biggest superstars of the moment. And they recorded a single, "We Are the World," to raise funds for poverty alleviation in Ethiopia. And let's go down to 1991, a film that we all celebrated, Blood Diamonds. Let's go down again to 1993. New York Times published a photograph of a vulture eyeing a frail boy in famine-stricken South Sudan. It was taken by the South African photographer Kevin Carter, and it won the Pulitzer Prize in 1994. Let's go down again to sometime in 2014. The Economist, one of the most respected, most authoritative platforms, they published an iconic cover that called Africa the hopeless continent. Right now, we are beginning to understand where I'm going to with this, right? And it was the cover of The Economist in 2000. This was just at the brink of new millennium. We're stepping into the new millennium, and we're being called hopeless, a hopeless place, right? And so that's the image that's stuck in the minds of a lot of people as we're being ushered into this new frontier, globally. Let's go down to 2012, and I'll be rushing now. Kony, a documentary about Ugandan rebel leader Joseph Kony and his movement. His movement's use of child soldiers is released, and listen to this, it got over 100 million views under 1 week. Now, it tells you the amount of people who consumed that content, and you can imagine the influence this would have had on what they thought about the continent of Africa. Let's go down to 2014. We had the Ebola outbreak, and it spread through Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and we saw a number of doomsday prophecies around Ebola. Let's go down to 2015. CNN, just before the Kenyan election, just before the visit of the US President Barack Obama, who was of Kenyan heritage, called Kenya, a hotbed of terror, And this was just before the visit of Barack Obama, with the entire attention of global media focused on Obama's visit to his homeland, Kenya. And this is the narrative about Kenya that was pushed out to the rest of the world. And so you can imagine, with that prime moment in global media, the conversation about Kenya was that of a terror-ridden country, and that's really not true. Let's go down to, and I'll rush through this, let's go down to 2020. Science magazine published an article, A Ticking Time Bomb. Scientists worried about coronavirus spread in Africa, yet a scientist quoted in the story confessed that we really have no idea how COVID will behave in Africa. On 3rd September, the BBC publishes an article with this headline, Coronavirus in Africa, Could Poverty Explain the Mystery of Low Death? So low death could not be attributed to anything else other than the fact that the continent is poor, and maybe it's due to poverty that they were able to survive coronavirus. Now, we all celebrated Coming to America, I love the movie, I loved it personally. But the subtext is, when you see the way Africa was depicted in some of the clips, some of the scenes in the movie, it sends this message of Africa, a country, a continent, where women took the back seats, right? And this is not the case. In many instances, you have women taking the front seats and playing leading roles, both in entrepreneurship, in small-scale businesses across many African countries. And we have very concrete examples. But that's not really what you tend to have at the back of your mind after watching films like Coming to America. Now, this damages the continent. All of these things damages the continent in so many ways, but I'll just pick one example. I don't know if you've heard about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It's a free trade area where the 54, 55 member states of Africa have come together to have one common market, just like you have the European Union. And the potential is that it could lift 68 million people out of poverty. It could generate over 450 billion in terms of additional income to Africa by 2050. Now, you would expect that such an important tool, such an important advancement in cooperation, in economic cooperation in Africa, would get so much media attention. But here's the thing, it gets only 1% of news and academic research. Just 1% of coverage of news and academic research makes reference to the continental free trade area and the potentials it has. And you would expect the reverse, because, this is exactly what the world has been saying. Come together, put your resources together, come together like one single market and do business and attract investments, and so on and so forth. But we see the reverse, which is a bit hypocritical to us. We see the reverse when it comes to coverage of these things, and why we are extremely sad by this. I'll go very quickly to what we need to do, right? Because we've talked about, I've lamented about how we got here, some of the consequences of what we see globally, but let's talk a bit about what we need to do. And I put a few points here. I think we need more balanced nuanced and contextual reporting about Africa in global media. I keep saying that Africa No Filter is not a PR organization. We're not here to say it's all a bed of roses in Africa. We know we've got challenges in Africa. We know we've got issues to sort out in Africa. But we are saying that that is not what defines us as a people. It's not what defines Africa. And that shouldn't be what the world comes to see about Africa every time they hear news or they read content or they watch content on TV about the continent. So I think what we are asking for is a more balanced reporting about Africa, more nuanced and contextual. I think we also need focused training for local journalists. You know, I did say that, okay, great. I did say that we got a big part of the work that needs to be done on our own selves as well, right? And so I think we need a lot of training. We need more collaboration between local and foreign media, and we also need institutional support. I've got just 3 more minutes, so I'm going to rush. This is what I need you all as media professionals to bear in mind. Stop, reflect, and think about the narratives you reinforce through the stories that you tell. Be conscious of framings and adopt nuanced, ethical, and balanced storytelling about Africa. We did a research some time ago and we produced this wonderful tool that speaks right to the heart of how to represent Africa in your stories. Just take a look.
Introducing the Africa Bias Buster, your creative companion for telling better stories about Africa. Let's see how it works. First of all, you log in or register, just as you would for any other app. Then you type or drag your document into the app. Now click on Check Your Story and watch the AI go to work. Let's try with this piece of writing about African entrepreneurs and see what the Bias Buster has to say. The tool spots something interesting, phrases like uniquely resilient and qualities others might lack. While these sound like compliments, they're actually subtle stereotypes that suggest African entrepreneurs are inherently different from entrepreneurs elsewhere. The AI doesn't just flag these issues and assign a score out of 5. It gives you specific recommendations to strengthen your writing. But if you're not happy with your score, just hit the Try Again button to submit a revised version. You can also use our Share button to send your results to colleagues or save them for later. And if you're ever stuck, our FAQ section is packed with practical tips and real examples of bias-free writing about Africa. Are you ready to take your writing to the next level? Let's get started with the Africa Bias Buster.
Great. Thank you very much. Now, this is a tool that I recommend to every one of you. And I will be stopping my presentation very shortly, but you can scan this or get in touch with me. Like I said, Africa No Filter, we invest a lot in producing the materials that can help you write about Africa better, communicate about Africa better, represent Africa better, advocate for Africa better. So you might have wonderful intentions, but you might be going about it the wrong way. And so these investments are to provide you the resources that you need to talk about Africa better. I will leave you with a video that talks about who we are and what we represent in Africa. And I would like you to have that at the back of your mind as the last thing you hear from me. Just in case you're in doubt, I had to wear the same outfit I wore to take that picture. So that's me on the far left. Gracias. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Víctor Mark-Onyegbu.